What's up, Crusaders? Welcome to a wonderful career chat we have today with top production manager Bobby Schneider. Listen, I say production manager because that's how I worked with Bobby. We toured for a very short time together out with Korn. He was the production manager with Korn when I worked with Bobby, and that's how him and I connected. I guess it's probably been a year or so ago now.
About 3 years, actually.
Oh, wow. Gosh, time flies. Well, I just want to welcome Bobby to the Career Chat. Dude, thank you for being here, man.
Oh, you're welcome. I'm looking forward to it.
I know we've been actually juggling schedules to try and get this done. Touring's like that, right? It's like you got an opening in your schedule, then you end up filling it, and then, we're trying to figure out how things line up. Of course, I know these days you're doing things differently than just touring, and so we'll get there. But I always like to start these things out, Bobby, by just kind of going way back. It's just important to kind of see where this passion started, the interest started. Maybe it didn't even start as a passion or an interest. Maybe like myself, you got pulled into this industry and then you found that you loved it over time. And so where are you from? Where'd you grow up? And what kind of initially sparked you
Hmm.
into working in events?
Well, I'll try to keep this short because I can talk, as most people know. So I at one point, when I started listening to rock and roll, namely probably my first big influence maybe was Jimi Hendrix. So I was, I don't know, maybe 13, 12 when I started. And I started loving music, and I tried to play a little bit, and got a classical guitar, and went and took lessons. And I mean, I've heard actually just heard Bruce Springsteen tell a story like this, where he went to the teacher and they were trying to teach him chords, and he says, "No, I want to play rock and roll." Well, he fared a little better in it than I did. Um, but I soon realized that nor I didn't have innate talent to become a rock star or even a guitar player, really, and that I didn't really have the patience, or the focus, and I all of a sudden wasn't really driven to play anymore, and just kind of let it go. And I went to see a lot of bands. So growing up in New York, it was different then, because I mean, kids took the subway at night. I mean, there was just a lot less shit going on. So anyway, I went to see this band called Mountain, which I don't know if
Mhm.
many of your listeners will know about. Great rock band, like fantastic rock band. And I'm standing on the floor. I went by myself. I don't know why no one went with me, but I went by myself. And I'm standing on the GA floor in what's now the theater at Madison Square Garden. Then it was called the Felt Forum. And I'm watching, whatever band went on first. And then Mountain comes on, and I'm in the crowd and I'm liking it. And at some point, he must have, Leslie West was a guitar player and the leader and everything, and his band. Anyway, he must have broke a string, or he's just changing guitars, which I had never seen that. I don't think I'd even been to a lot of concerts, right, or where I would have noticed it. So then a roadie came out and handed him another guitar, and like a light bulb went off, and I go, "That's what I'm going to fucking do." But I didn't even really know what the guy was called. Had to ask, like, I was a kid. I had to ask some adult next to me, "Hey, who's that guy?" "That's a roadie." Like, all right. And I remember going home that night. My mother checking my eyes for weed smoking. Thank you for Visine. And and I said, "Hey, I found out what I want to do when I grow up," or whatever I said. She said, "Oh yeah, what's that?" I said, "I'm going to be a roadie." Now, in the culture of Jewish families, every mother's son's going to be a doctor or a lawyer. That's just kind of how it goes. Or they're gonna do something like that, some field like that, and they're going to be ambitious and successful, and they're going to go to college and everything. So I didn't even think about any of that. She said, "Well, do you have to go to school for it?" I said, "I don't think so." Anyway, little time went on, and I used to go to boarding school, and in a place called Stockbridge, Massachusetts, and it was a very progressive school. Stockbridge was the hippie haven of Massachusetts, and People like Arlo Guthrie went to this school. I mean, it was pretty cool. And I think we even a mutual friend, brought a bunch of musicians up from New York, and they did a concert there, and I helped them set up. So the bug had bitten me already. And then that summer, so now I was 14, going on 15, and I was always younger in the class because my birthday was in December, and you know, parents make a decision: do they send their kid who's about to be 5 to kindergarten, or do they wait till the next year? They probably couldn't wait for me to get out of the house. So anyway, I'm a young kid. I finished. That would have probably been, I don't even know if that would have been my freshman and maybe my freshman year. I don't really remember.
Eighth grade.
Anyway, I make a friend up there in school, and he's cool, and he says, "Hey, listen, he's been in the area for a while. This is his second, third year at the school." And he said, "Listen, why don't you come with me this summer, and we could live at this place called Music Inn." So Music Inn was a lot of history. And Music Inn sometime in the 1920s was a working farm in the Berkshires. Beautiful. And then the farm shut down, and someone from the arts community with a lot of money bought it, and they had another venue there, and great jazz players: Dizzy Gillespie, Coltrane, Miles Davis, Brubeck. I mean, all the great players played there, because Stockbridge or Lenox, right, neighboring town. That's also where the Boston Pops plays, at Tanglewood. So down the street from Tanglewood was this hippie place called Music Inn that had been this farm. And at one point, they turned the farm into a jazz school for students, for Tanglewood, and, just for the arts in the area. And, 20, 30, 40 kids came through. They had converted many of the buildings to like dormitories or single rooms. And then that kind of faded out. And then another guy who was still alive and celebrating his 90th birthday, maybe I could send him this clip. His name is David Rothstein. Anyway, he's an architect and brilliant man. And he bought it and turned it into a venue, and had a natural amphitheater down a hill. It was, so they let us live in a clock tower, the old clock tower in the barn. The rest of the barn had been converted to rooms. Clock tower was just empty, but it was the real clock tower. So all the guts were out. So me and my buddy lived in this clock tower for the summer. And during the week, we used to do odd jobs. I liked it because they let me drive a truck around the grounds. And on weekends, we were going to, do the shows. We were going to park cars, like direct traffic. Well, that lasted for me for 2 shows until I wangled my way down to the stage and became, long before there were runners, there were gophers. So I was a gopher.
Okay.
Now, I knew how to drive, but I was 14. I didn't even have a learner's permit. And of course, doing that job, part of your job is to drive. So anyway, I did it and hung around with a lot of roadies and learned whatever I could and got steeped in it, and went back the next summer, worked security because I was a big kid. So I worked security, and then someone else I worked with security with, he said, "Hey, do you know how to set drums up?" Because he knew I wanted to be a roadie, and I was always by the stage. And I said, "Oh yeah, I'd never set a drum up in my life. Much less tuned one." So I worked for this sort of regional band, and a lot of local bands in those days were kind of funk bands. I still talk to the drummer. Name is Skip Fisher. And so I worked my way in there. I did all right. I mean, whatever I didn't know, I faked. I never asked a question. I never pretended I didn't know. And that's where I started. And it was never a choice for me. I mean, it was like
a calling.
Oh yeah. I mean, I knew what I wanted to do. I never looked back from that point on.
Before you move on, I just want to recap, because what a trip, man. I mean, what a blessing looking back that you actually were right in the midst of all of that art and all of those musicians and that venue and that specific time and space, because how many parents would let their 14-year-old or 13-year-old really go by themselves
Yeah,
downtown New York City to
yeah.
Manhattan to go see a show to, to even get that sort of influence? Like that was, I mean, I can't imagine it was probably even safe back then, but what were your parents thinking?
Well, it was my mom. My dad was around very much in my life, but they separated, and
Okay.
my mom was my mom was very progressive. She might not have been the lovey-dovey bake apple pie mom, but she really pushed me to explore my passion.
Okay.
Um, I got to get a little broken up here.
Yeah.
She was a patron of the arts. She took me to see Jesus Christ Superstar, which was very, at that point, I mean, that they cursed in the movie. I'm sure there was, not in the movie, in the play, it was on Broadway. Nudity, I mean, big deal in that time anyway.
And this was the 70s, is that right?
Yeah.
Okay, what a trip. So it was that kind of decade where disco was starting to kind of fizzle a little bit and rock and roll was coming in pretty heavy and pretty hardcore. What did your parents think about rock and roll? As a lot of parents from those days thought it
I
was
mean,
obviously
there
not
was always music in my house. I mean, they had a great record collection. My dad was quite the dancer. So
interesting.
I mean, I think my mother was a single mom, right? She raised me. She worked very busy. My dad was around, but he had his own issues. So I
Mm,
don't know that it ever came up, but they always supported me. Always,
sounds like
always supported me. I was trouble. And, I was smoking weed and
and
cutting
that's why they sent you to
school. And,
boarding school.
oh, well, yeah, that at one point it was a boarding school. And then I came home and I cut so many classes that my mother really couldn't deal with it. And I went to another school, which was kind of hard edge. It was kind of I don't know, let's say it was a mild reform school, but I got my street smarts there, but they always supported me and no matter what. So, yeah, when I told them that summer, now I was back in a boarding school after that, and then I met this kid, Jimmy Reardon, and I told her that I didn't want to go to summer camp. I'd gone to the same summer camp since I was like 6 or 7. Now I'm 14, going on 15, and that was a milestone summer because when you're 15 in this camp, you could be a counselor's aide,
Mm.
which meant you get to stay up later, you could drink soda. I mean,
Tell
whatever
the
else.
kids
I
what
mean,
to do.
you'd earn that right from being there. And I was no longer interested in that. And they let me. I mean, my mom came to visit me at that place in Lenox, and she to get up to where we lived, you had to climb a straight ladder from the barn, from the barn floor up to the hayloft, and from the hayloft, that was that. Then one other flight up was where the clock tower was, or the clock was. She climbed up there and saw it, and I don't know, like I said, she was very progressive. I mean, till I'm thinking about it now, I didn't really even remember. I think they had their own thing going on, and I mean, I was passionate, I was happy. So I
Right.
mean, I was doing what I dreamed of without even working towards it.
Right. Yeah. Just kind of being around it and falling into it. And really, I think that it's a community in the industry, obviously in the event industry, and it always has been. And I think that it welcomes people like us, people that were a little bit different. And of
Oh
course,
yeah.
you were a musician as well. So here you are, you're 15, and you get out with this regional band through all
Oh,
of
I
that.
was I was older by then. Yeah, I was
Okay.
15, right. I had a learner's permit by then, so I was
Okay.
15. You're right.
So 15 into 16, you're out with a regional band, like just up in the New England area, or
Yeah, mostly New England, upstate New York, that kind of regional area.
and you hadn't traveled
Um,
much by this point, right?
well, yeah, we traveled around in a van, and they had some gear, and I mean, you were never really on the road. It was kind of weekends. And I was still living at home. And at that point, I think somewhere in there, I got tossed out of high school because I never went to the classes. And I really was only interested in the high school for girls and probably weed. Um, but I mean, whatever class I was interested in, I did well. It was never that I couldn't learn or that I just was only interested in music.
I understand
So I
that.
got tossed out of the high school after cutting and smoking weed and all kinds of other things. And I went into this progressive school for kind of kids like me, 15, 16, able to learn, smart, learning not limited to what they could learn except by themselves. And at that point, I followed this group back that I'd worked with in Lenox. Now I lived in Boston, and they did shows at the Harvard Square Theater in Cambridge, and they brought me along to do security. So, I mean, I don't think anyone had any idea how old I was. They never asked me.
You were just a big
Never
kid.
said, "Hey, kid, how old are you?" I mean, I had 18-year-old girlfriends, and I mean, no one but me knew how old I was. It was pretty fucking spectacular. I mean, it's funny. I'm sitting here in my I have a window seat in my house that you can see faces the woods and the mountains. It's pretty incredible. And this is often where I meditate. And there's a picture up here that says, "Realizing I grew up too young, fell in love too young, dealt with the hardest battles too young, and now I'm an overstimulated adult who has been in fight or flight mode most of my life and trying to be the best version of myself."
Yeah.
And when I read that, I thought, oh, yeah, that's me.
Explains it. Well, speaking of which, fight or flight. So there you are. You're like working in Boston as a security guy sometimes with this one band, and you're going on the road with these folks. Like, where was that gap to realizing, like, okay, well, I need to start, or I'm going to start, or I'm being pushed into starting to specialize and making this into a career versus just an opportunity to go and have some fun? Was there ever an
I
instant?
don't know that it was a vehicle to have fun. I just knew I couldn't do anything else.
Yeah,
And, much to, trying to find the right word, much to not chagrin, but we'll use that for now. I never considered it a job. I
hmm
never even considered it a career. I mean, realize I didn't really, a lot of the things you learn, especially in those last 2 years of high school, are interacting with people and where maybe you're going to lead to. You're honing your interest. How am I going to learn about this? College is the next step, or if you wanted to be a tradesman, you'd be a journeyman or whatever. Never even dawned on me. And my family, my mom, was in business. I mean, she was a pioneer in her field, and she was busy. And like I said, she wasn't really the lovey-dovey mom, right? That watched everything I did and said, "Hey, listen, it's okay, you like this, but you need to finish this before I'm going to let you do it." There was no control in me, really. And my dad had his own issues, so I think they just let it happen. And I never thought of this as a job. I mean, and that definitely plagued me later on. And it wasn't so much that it was fun; it was just that was what I was doing.
I completely understand that. Very similar. Once when Nate got this hooks onto me when I was a homeless teenager, and that was it. I mean, I was called, pulled, convicted. There was nothing. I wasn't doing anything else. So, at what point though did you level up from working in the region, Boston, all that area? At what point did you kind of like start to feel like, oh man, I'm actually a professional in the event business?
None of us thought like that back
Yeah.
then. I mean, we never thought of ourselves as professionals. We were guys that set the gear up, right? And there were no women doing what we did at that point. None. I feel like I'm not being boastful, but I know I feel like I've always done a good job. But there is a darker side to being so young, not really realizing what you're doing, not grasping it as for longevity or career, as you say. So the first band I worked for, I don't I don't really remember what happened, but they were like, "Look, man, you're a little too wild. You're not focusing or whatever. So we're gonna let you go." And I never really stopped to figure out why. I just went on to the next band, and then Boston at that point was a thriving music scene, like thriving. And I got made friends with another guy who's still my lifelong friend, a guy named John Callahan, and He worked for a couple of the bigger bands in New England, and then he kind of took me under his wing.
Okay.
And I I don't know. I think I was doing that progressive school at that point. And then I wanted to be a sound engineer initially, but
What sparked wanting to be a sound engineer?
I don't know, just another interest. And, and I felt it was something I could do because I could hear things in music and I wanted to learn how to make it better. And I don't know, it just seemed like a better role. So my mom paid for me to go to a studio class, like an in-person studio class where the classes were in the studio and, you learned some of the mathematics of audio, which, you have to have that, especially now, but you have to have that under your belt, because it wasn't like you were a musician playing a guitar. Even then, you'd have to have some practice and some knowledge and maybe some training or lessons or, wherever you got that from. I just wanted to be a sound engineer. So she paid for me to go to this school, famous studio in Boston. It was called Synchro Sound or something Media Sound. God, I can't remember the name. It ended up, Aerosmith recorded Dream on there. The Cars ended up buying it in the end.
Oh, wow.
I don't believe it's there anymore. But she paid for me to go to this school, and I finagled the band I was working for, which was probably the second band I worked for, to go into that studio because we were doing, culminated in like a live session with the band. And it was the band I worked for in the studio recording. So I think early on I was putting things together, and I never really took stock in it, honestly. I look back, I sort of wish I had spent a little more time honing my adulthood
Mm-hmm.
and learning, critical thinking a little better than I did, other than just kind of, I wouldn't say bumbling on, but I just did whatever I did, whatever fell. Anyway, so I worked for that band. Now I was working for a couple of bigger bands and that maybe traveled outside of New England.
Anybody that actually had hits on the radio and things like
Oh
that at
yeah,
that point?
the first big band I worked for in Boston that actually they had a hit, they had a record out, and it's funny how I got the job. I'll tell this story real quick. It was good. And talk about tenacity. So somehow I heard this band called Duke and the Drivers, which really is a famous Boston band, needed a roadie. So someone gave me this guy Alan Kaufman's number. Rest in peace. Became family. I chased him around for about a week, and he never called me back. But I was driven. I was going to get this job. So I don't know that he ever called. I think maybe he called me back. He said, "Well, yeah, come to this show." Sure, I was driving. I must have borrowed a car, and I went to the show by myself. Met him, and he said, I don't really know what you know, but just because you're here, I'm going to hire you. So that was really a very pivotal step for me because they had been on tour. They had a record out. They were a professional band, right? So that was kind of my first taste of it. And that was the start. Maybe then I kind of realized it was a job, but it always felt like a calling more than a job. I got paid, but the old joke about doing it for, the girls, the beer, and the t-shirts was never far from my mind.
Well, that's right. And which roadies were kind of that's the MO for being an old roadie was that you kind of were out there for more of that than the paycheck.
Oh yeah, the paycheck was a bonus, and eventually, as you get to be an adult, you needed money and you needed to pay your own rent. But my mom always supported me, and so I went from maybe that job, and the first real touring job I had was I worked for the Cars
Wow.
on their first tour. I was drum roadie.
Okay.
Um, and that lasted for about a year. And I either I was starting to say that it's very important that I believe if I could go back and maybe have waited a couple of years, it's very important that you learn the value of your worth and that you, like I said, critical thinking and how to interact, and
Communication.
also the hierarchy of having a job and having someone in charge of you, and that sure, this was fun and it was great, and you were partying, girls, beer, t-shirts, drugs, whatever, but that it really was, it hadn't, it maybe it was it was already a business, really. It started to dawn on me as I went through a few situations that didn't last because I had a big mouth. And what I'm getting to is I always felt I had to pretend that I knew everything.
Mm.
So I always had to talk louder. I always had to storm in there and just push my way in, when maybe that was true when I was 14 or 15, although I was very quiet then because I was in awe of the whole thing. Somehow it turned out from being in awe to being, I don't know, belligerent, maybe.
Yeah.
Maybe not. I didn't start fights or anything, but I mean, being mouthy and being a
Ego.
know-it-all. And I'm pretty sure, I know for a fact, as I'm 65 now, and I look back on my life, that was something that took me years to learn. Years.
Yeah.
I got to say that that little bit has plagued me my whole career and my whole life. And
Yeah.
it's taken me till the past couple of years, now that I've slowed down, and I've repeated patterns of that, because I'm a yogi, and I practice. And one of the teachers I listened to said something. He said, "How you do anything is how you do everything," and
True.
that's really true, whether you realize it or not. So
Certainly true. Well, before we jump too far ahead, though, because I definitely want to talk more about that, and I think one of the biggest reasons why you and I are have been aligned since we met was because of the fact of that awareness of how that hadn't served you to the best of your ability, which is what really connected us, I think, while we were out on Korn together. But let me ask you though, going back in Crew Coach, we talk a lot about tenacity and making sure you go and get them and to follow up and to really learn communication. Because in Crew Coach, we don't teach any of the technical stuff. It's all about why. It's all about communication. It's all about relationships. It's all about putting those pieces together, presenting yourself the right way. But also, what you said lastly was how you do anything is how you do everything, and showing the people that are in your community in this event industry that you're doing things the best way that you can and putting your best foot forward. It's definitely something that back then there was nothing like that available, no sort of guidance available. Was there any mentors for you during this time? I know you mentioned a couple of people, but from the moment you joined the Cars was and felt like you were starting to become a little bit more professional with it, learning sound, was there a mentor, somebody that continued to take you under
yeah,
their wing?
yeah, the guy that really gave me my first break, John Callahan,
Mm.
who went on to work for Tony Bennett, Bonnie Raitt, and Little Feat. I mean, we always stayed friends, and I don't know, he's probably got 5, 6 years on me. So, he had been established. Yeah, I mean, he continued to mentor me, and often there are a couple of times he grabbed me and like, "What the fuck are you doing? You
Yeah.
can't treat people like that."
Yeah.
And I mean, I learned a lot from him. I didn't always practice it as I went on because I still had this, fear of the other shoe's going to drop.
Right.
So instead of having boundaries to stay within my own boundaries and with other people, and to find the right way to do things, I continued to just storm in.
Yeah.
But John mentored me all along, and he still does.
I love that. So from the Cars, what was your next role, or how long did you stay with the Cars? And then what was your kind of
I think about a year or so, and and I got let go there too. So I have nothing to hide. And the one friend, Alan, who I mentioned before, was had be at this point had sort of had become a manager in the Boston music scene, and he had me work for a couple of bands, and then I got connected through him to this one band who they were fabulous. They really should have been big. Called SAS, SASS, and they were like a family. They're two brothers, Italian, close-knit family, and they were just good. They already had a huge following. They, definitely sounded like they should have a hit. So Alan took them over and started trying to get them a deal. And then along I came, and they did not trust me. I don't think they trusted Alan either. But I stuck with that for a really long time.
Okay.
And I at a very young age, maybe 18 by then, Alan fell out with them. There was another figure that worked for them that before he came along kind of managed them, and he left and I managed them for a while.
Wow.
And I just remember the phone bills in those days because, it's not like it was now. It wasn't all free. Everything was landlines and everything cost money, even if you called out of your network.
Of course.
So, there were a couple of $100 phone bills that my mom paid, but, she always really encouraged me no matter what the fallout was. And by then, I'd started working around, but I was still pretty pushy and obnoxious and condescending,
Arrogant.
and I realize now it's how people that act in that vein, it's kind of a cry for help and it's kind of a mask you put on. So anyway, I was with them for a very long time, and I think then I got offered a touring job, my first touring job.
Now, real quick, Bobby, before you
Yeah.
tell me about this, I did have a quick question because obviously you're working directly with these artists and you're doing sound, right? Like, is it front of house?
No.
No.
I did on and off, but
Okay.
for most of what I'm just talking about, I was a roadie.
Okay, a general roadie, because that was what it was back then, right?
And I started to become in charge just by my personality
Right, the take charge attitude.
more than my knowledge. I always, even as a kid, I wanted to be the boss. So
Okay, that makes sense. Now, let me ask you though, just a quick production question. Was it like Claire Brothers Audio and upstaging lighting? Like, what were the companies that provided for tours back then? Just
I wasn't even. I mean, at that point, I was never really exposed to companies at all because
it's all
for
venues.
the first band, that the one that I ended up kind of, I won't say managing, but look, I did kind of. Anyway, that was a club band, so
Oh,
you
okay.
carry anything but your
Gotcha.
equipment. I mean, maybe they carried some PA, and in the end, then I worked for another band, and I was their sound guy. But mostly, I wanted to be a tour manager or crew chief or
Gotcha.
to run things. I don't even know that I even had a title. But
Right.
basically, I was a roadie. I took a lot of pride in that. I took a lot of pride in loading the truck and moving the gear, and all of that came with it. It was like being a cowboy.
Oh yeah, we came a long way. Now we're techs, right? Now we're touring crew. It's a
Yeah,
different.
we're
We're
everyone listening to this, and I'll say this very honestly: we are all roadies. Whether you're a tour manager, whether you're a tour director, whether you're a lighting person, we're all roadies. That's the pride in this. I think the whole tech thing, it doesn't sit with me. I still call myself a roadie.
I
I still
understand.
call people that I work with roadies. I mean, less and less because younger people want to be technicians, and I mean, you all go to school for it now, and you come out. But sadly, there's a lot lost in that, I think, because you know, going to school and then going on tour, you don't know shit. You
No.
really don't. You might know how a knob works or, how a signal path works,
Mm-hmm.
which many of us didn't know. We learned, but
Right.
it just wasn't it. The roadie was a camaraderie,
Yeah.
with other ones, with other bands you met as you travel around. You'd meet other crews and other roadies, and you look at someone that was working, say, for a real big touring band. Like when I worked for the Cars, we did some festivals, and there was Fleetwood Mac and Journey, and I remember watching a production manager direct like where to put the drum riser. And I mean, I thought that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to be that guy. And I watched how these guys operate. So
Well,
that was the change for me.
yeah, and I understand that. Of course, I think one of the biggest reasons why, as we started to corporatize the industry, and there was schools popping up and things like that, and monopolizing with these big companies, these big production companies. I think that the roadie delineation is kind of taken as a negative because it's still attached to that sex, drug, and rock and roll. And I think that that's the biggest thing about it. But just to let you know, here in Crew Coach, we have a lot of people that have like degrees from Full Sail or SAE or all these different schools. And the reason why they're here in Crew Coach is because they don't teach you how to go and actually build a career and get the experience, because what we know is that degree or not, everyone starts at the bottom of the experience ladder, no matter what. And so we're definitely in the right place to be able to encourage the fact that you got to get out there on the road to get this experience. So that
I agree. Honestly, I wish there had been some schools. And like I just said a little while ago, that, if I had the whole thing to do over, which of course is ridiculous, but, maybe I, with a little different direction, maybe I would have taken some time to learn some life basics, which would have made how I dealt with people,
yeah.
and how I acted and everything else a little more fine tuned, you
Yeah.
know.
Well,
But
we definitely know, because we have people that join Crew Coach and say the same thing. They're just like, man, I had the worst experience on this last tour, and it was, drama and tension and arguments and all these different things. And it's like, they're like, man, I wish I had this coaching and this guidance while I was out there. I would have definitely handled myself differently. So, here in Crew Coach, we really take pride in being basically right now the only service that's provided to touring crew that offers this sort of guidance, to get to have somebody like you tell it like, hey, this is not a good thing to kind of approach work in this way. And so it's pretty cool to hear you say that, having gone through your career. Speaking of which, let's get back to it. The tour that you were about to say, your leap from the Cars on.
well, yeah, I went from the Cars to local bands, and
That's,
then I got offered a tour with another Boston band, was still in the Boston music scene.
yeah.
They had a couple, I think they had one record out, and they were very popular. But still, we drove around with a truck full of equipment. I don't think maybe we carried a little bit of audio, or maybe a console. I'm not even sure we did that. No lights or anything, 2 or 3 person crew. I'd driven back and forth across this country in a yellow Ryder truck. I mean, maybe 100 times now, and that was the life. And we went from city to city, and like I said, it was mostly clubs. I mean, but I started getting exposed, of course, to production and bigger tours and professionalism. Even when I worked for the Cars, because I mean they were like, we opened those days, an opening act or baby band. Not really sure I love that term, but whatever.
Yeah.
A new band would just go around and open. I mean, and you bounced around. It was like sometimes you didn't even know where you were going next. You were out working, and then you're going to go to Dallas tomorrow, and you're going to open for Atlanta Rhythm Section, and then you're going to go here, and you're going to open for the Doobie Brothers, and then you're going to go do a day on the green, with Bill Graham, and you're going to play the Roxy. So at that point with the Cars is in the 70s is when I started getting exposed to the bigger life. And I worked for this other band for a long time after the Cars. And then that just started leading to more and more bands. I mean, by that time I knew managers,
Yeah.
and I
Relationship.
had, there was a magazine called Performance, and the best way at that point was to get in with an agent and find out what was going on. And I wrote letters, and I mean, I was very tenacious in trying to get work. So after that band and after that tour, they kind of fizzled out. So I don't really know exactly what happened. Maybe I worked for a couple other Boston bands. And then at one point I interviewed to work for Jay Giles' band, but I
Okay.
didn't get the job. And then, I continued on around Boston working for this band. I worked for a lighting company. I did anything. I was a stagehand, mostly a crew chief stagehand by this point, because, of course, I had to be in charge. But I did whatever. I worked local, stagehand everywhere. I ended up getting called back to Jay Giles' band now to do something which I really knew how to do, because I had done it a couple of times, to be a drum roadie.
Hmm.
And I had already done that for a little bit, and that was great. They were, oh my God, they were the best live band ever. And by then I had settled in. I mean, they were professional. Claire Brothers was out. They carried lights, you know. Peter Wolf was a big showman. And I mean, things were timed. And I really started getting exposed to what it was like. And I was digging it. Then Giles broke up. They actually were going to bring me into the studio. And I was kind of new in the camp. So I'm figuring, shit, I'm set for life. And you don't really, but I never really looked back and said, oh, well, it's here today, gone tomorrow sometimes. But
Hmm.
through that job, I cinched the real ultimate beginning, big start of my career. I got hired to work for Tony Thompson, drummer for a band called Chic originally, but was on David Bowie and on Serious Moonlight, which was a huge tour. And even for Bowie, who was famous by then, but he had never played stadiums. And now he was huge. And that's it. That was that was a big, big, big step up.
Oh yeah.
And we were on the road for 2 years, and I made contacts I still have.
You went overseas during that time?
Oh yeah, all over the world. I mean, my own patting myself on the back. I did a good job.
Yeah.
I didn't get fired. I didn't piss it. I probably pissed some people off. I was pretty wild at that point, I have to say, but a lot of that wildness then was still accepted. So, but that was what I had been working for all along. And,
Right.
I never tried. I, I never calculated this. I mean, let's look at someone in the typical world. Goes to high school, gets good grades, has whatever kind of solid, family life. I mean, not for everybody, but and they go to college and they pick their choice of whether it's business or they're going to be a doctor, a lawyer, professional, and they go work for a company and that's it. That's their job. And whether they in some instances they still start out low, like most agents started in the mailroom, but like a typical person that would go to college and have a job, that's to them that's a career. you know a lot of people that go to work, say for an insurance company, they start out low on the totem pole, then they become a manager, they move up. But a lot of people work for the same company their whole lives, and their job is a job. It's something they go to and they come back from. And maybe they're good at it, and maybe they like it, maybe they hate it, but their solace and I think their joy, in most senses, leads to their family
Hmm.
and raising a family and having a home and sending your kids to college and your neighborhood. I never lived that life. I never even was exposed to that life. So I'm not saying I missed it. I think some of that sort of come back around, but it was a pretty wild time. So yeah, Bowie. And after Bowie, I mean, now I was in the big leagues.
New relationships.
I mean,
Name was being tossed
yeah,
around.
yeah, and I knew agents, and I mean, I could take people picked up my phone calls, and then I got my through doing Bowie and the people I knew, I got my first production manager job. Now, I had never been a production manager. Like I had been a crew chief, and maybe on tours, earlier tours I did, I was like, well, there were only three of us, so I mean, I was the boss or whatever, but it didn't really have a title. Now I got hired to be a production manager, and I had to learn very, very fast what to do. And I had other mentors, who I remember a guy that I had worked with early on, a guy named Rick Sales, who now manages, he's kind of retired, but he managed Slayer and he managed Ghost. But, he had been around and he had toured with a lot of bands as a tour manager and, a bit older than me. And I remember him sitting down and saying, look, you got to have your shit together on this. When we worked together on this club tour, you were fucking wild and you drove the truck and, you did this and that. You can't do that anymore because now you're a leader and you have to have certain things in place. And it was trial by fire, really. I mean, I was still pretty wild because I still felt like I didn't really know what I was doing. I was still loud. still, wanting to be the big man on campus with drugs or whatever else. I mean, that was how I felt was going to keep my position, so to speak, or, my leadership. Again, looking in the wrong places, but I did a good job and worked for them. And at that point, I was in the market. I worked for other bands. I was a production manager. I
What was that
mean,
first PM gig that you did?
big country.
Big Country. And then what was the next? You said you did a couple more production managers.
And I worked after big country. I worked for Laurie Anderson as a production manager,
Okay.
which was very interesting because, Laurie's a avant-garde artist and she's a New Yorker. And, they were, they were not rock and roll at all. I mean, they were like almost Broadway, and but they were touring. And I knew a little bit about touring, and they were failing a couple of shows in. So they called me in and someone else and a friend of mine. And, we sort of streamlined how things should be done. And it got better for everybody. I mean, it became like, oh, we're going to load in here and you're going to do this. And I ran the tour.
Yeah.
So very thankful to her because I know I was even a lot for her. And I'd have to look back and, remember where I went from there, but that was the start. Oh, wait, what came after that? Shortly after that, I think, went back to being a stagehand, had worked for Bowie. I think Laurie Anderson actually came after Bowie.
So after Lori, you're in the business, you're making moves, you're a production manager, but you're also working local as well. How was that? Was that an ego trip for you?
I didn't care. Nope. I was just happy to be working. Matter of fact, for, in between tours, I drove a cab in Boston. I didn't care.
Yeah.
I mean, I knew what I wanted, and, I had the drive. Oh, so big thing here. So worked local for a little while, and Boston was quite the scene at that point. I mean, many, many bands, popular place. So I used to work at a rock club as a stagehand, sort of, again, not that it matters, crew chief. And one day we did a band called Metallica, who I'd never heard of. I didn't even really know. To me, hard rock was Black Sabbath, right? That kind of music. And I liked that, but I didn't really ever work in that genre. Anyway, this tour had Metallica and had a band called Wasp, who were kind of big bullies, and they weren't really selling all the tickets. Metallica was in the middle with another band called Armored Saint. Anyway, a buddy of mine was working for Metallica. They had an incident. They fired their drum roadie, a couple of days after they'd been through Boston. And my friend, Bob Yurko, was driving a truck for them and said, look, we were just in Boston. Like, this guy, Bobby Schneider, just finished working on David Bowie. And, he's the guy. You need to bring him in. So they hired me and as a drum roadie, but there was no one running things. And they were still on this tour with Wasp, who were stepping all over them. And I was never scared of anything. I mean, I wasn't really a fighter, but I mean, I didn't take any shit from anybody. And I started not having, our crew, Metallica crew, not taking any shit from anybody. And, eventually, the guy who was the tour manager, who's also a famous name, Howard Ungerleider, owe him a lot too. He was leaving to go back to Rush. And, they're, who are we going to get to be the tour manager? And he said to the managers, who are, big time, they were Q Prime, Peter Mensch, Cliff Bernstein. They said, well, we'll just have Bobby do it. He's been running things anyway. And I ended up taking that over. And I became I don't even know how old I was.
20-something.
20-something. I don't even think I was 30 yet. I became their tour manager. And I worked with them. I worked with them for probably another 5 years after that.
Oh, wow.
And yeah, man, I earned my chops, and I stayed with Q Prime. I worked for Tesla, who toured with Def Leppard for years. I then ended up working with Slayer and Tesla and other metal bands. And Yeah, then I'd have to look back, but that
And
was
when you were
that was
working,
very Metallica was very pivotal for me.
it sounds like it. And during that time, I mean, were you doing just TMing or were you TM PM?
Well, there. I mean, I don't. There really wasn't a PM. I
Okay.
mean, till a little later, but for a while, they were an opening act. Like their big break came. I wouldn't say break, but because they were already popular. But their big time came when they opened for Ozzy,
Okay.
and everyone realized that Metallica were selling more shirts than Ozzy.
Right, right. That's
But also during that, I also made more contacts with all the Ozzy production people, and then I got to see how trucks got loaded, and how production was in. I mean, I had been exposed to it, but now I guess I was at a level to where I could really observe it, and that was probably another huge step for me.
I'm sure. And let me ask you, during that time, you're getting all this experience, you're getting experience at a high level, but also getting credibility at a high level because of your title and your responsibility and the bands that you're working with, the management company, your experience, you're kind of doing all those duties of TMing and PMing and all of that. At what point did you feel like the industry from a production standpoint shifted to the more corporate model that we see today?
I think it was starting to happen at that point. People, it had sort of become a job, and I was paying my own bills at that point. I think sometime during Metallic, I got married,
Okay.
um, and so life was more responsibility, a little more serious, and I noticed that you people were maybe a little less wild, maybe a little less, probably not much at that point, but it had kind of turned into a business, and I couldn't pretend that I was the kid anymore, because now I was the one that knew stuff and other people were kids. So I had bigger expectations, more responsibility. I mean, you always say better be careful what you wish for, and here it was sitting in my lap. And I think at that point it kind of set in, and as we went on, things just weren't accepted anymore, right? They just
Mhm.
you had to follow some guidelines. I mean, mothers were hiding their daughters. I mean, I think they always had been, but you drug use wasn't quite as rampant, and you were expected to be there on time to do your job. And like I said, once you get old enough to assume the responsibility, now you have it. So you got to find your right way through.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I mean, now obviously things are way different. I mean, I
Well,
coach people to start out with high standards and worth and confidence and communication and all these things, not that you still got to go through it and put yourself through the paces to flesh it all out to figure out your way. But I mean, now we kind of like are forced to kind of have those higher standards because a lot of these productions just will not put up with any of it. I mean, I remember some of my friends out with Britney Spears saying that they banned Red Bull because she was addicted to Red Bull and you just couldn't have Red Bull out on the road. It's like, what? It's just the nature of this
yeah,
industry.
used to be cocaine,
Or that's right.
but yeah, the business started to change because I mean, there were a lot of bands, and there were a lot of companies, and people had things vested. So as a roadie, you couldn't go into. I mean, not that anybody ever should have, but we were pretty belligerent. We would tell anybody to fuck off, and smoke a joint or do a line of blow in front of them. And we were. I always say that most roadies were a dysfunctional bunch of miscreants, right? Because what else could we do? And I think shortly after that, like if you worked for Clare Brothers, you had a code of ethics, right?
Right.
You came,
Not
they
anymore.
groomed people, right? You couldn't act the same way, because you'd lose your benefits, and then benefits became important. And
Right.
all of a sudden, it wasn't just a bunch of wild people doing whatever they did without thinking about it. Now, people went to work for companies like, Upstaging and Clare Brothers, and R.A. Roth and Electrotech. Now, these company guys were professionals, and many of them had been trained, whether wasn't really school training, because I think Full Sail was the first one, and that was mostly audio. And a lot of us old guys made, we weren't even old guys then, but we made a lot of jokes about you can't learn this in school. And the truth is that you can learn a lot in school, but like you said, you'd never learn hard knocks in school.
That's right.
But there's not as many hard knocks as there used to be. I mean, it's
Do you think a lot of
you
that
know,
these hard knocks? I mean, obviously logistics and travel, and there's a lot of comforts that have been raised. But do you think a lot of the hard knocks were brought upon by you guys
oh yeah.
through the debauchery of it all?
Oh, yeah. I mean, well, and never mind, we raised people. I mean, you had to earn respect.
Yeah, yeah.
So if you were the kid, you were given the shit jobs. Might
I
have
don't even
got
think we do
yelled
tour
at.
pranks anymore. It used to be like tour pranks was a
Oh my God, we had so much fun. Birthday couldn't go by without everyone, 40 people, with whipped cream pies and
oh yeah.
all kinds of debauchery going on. I mean that, but shortly after that, that just kind of stopped being the thing. It just
Yeah.
really, it sort of, I mean, it was, and then it just waned down. It wasn't acceptable because look, now bands were corporations, right? I mean, let's even say early on with Metallica. I mean, they were a corporation. They had huge money in the bank. There was a label, that depended on them. I mean, there were a lot of moving parts. And if you were someone that worked for them that made trouble for either within your own circle or being belligerent and being the kind, and I was that person, so I'm not claiming anything other than that went into places you left and people would go, oh my God, I hope they never come back here again. That became detrimental to the person acting like that. And I mean, I don't know when, lawsuits started. I remember a couple of early ones. There's a difference between working for a company, like, for instance, like Claire Brothers or any one of the other, huge organizations now, to where, you answer to someone, you have a direct boss, you go through reviews, you get promoted, you're so on and so forth. I mean, even now, I'd say when you work for the band, you still got away with a lot more. When you were a backline guy working for the band, you were like sort of closer to the band. So maybe you got a single room, and you were never really reviewed. There were a couple bands starting to get professional like that, which started treating it like a business. Journey, for instance, I knew my dear departed friend Benny Collins would tell me that what they did at the end of every tour is they did a review of how the tour went and how the crew was and what could they do better. I mean, I don't really see people even doing that now.
Yeah, I mean,
You know,
companies do it, but few and far between do artists do it. I was with a band called the Van Perry, and they used to do it every year to give you raises. They would bring you into an office and give you a review. But yeah, you're right. I mean, that was, even for me, that was 12 years into my career. Things were just different. I mean, even when I started 22 years ago touring, it's like night and day on what it is now.
yeah, I mean, I agree. I think I don't recall which you did when we did Korn. It was the winter time, right?
Oh man, I don't remember. It was like us and
It,
Evanescence, POD, I think.
oh, okay. So no, that was Sheds, but
Shit.
trying to no, I don't know what's. Let's move on. I'll come back to what I was thinking about.
That's okay.
Get
Well,
ahead of myself every now and then.
let me just ask you, how do you feel about how it's all changed? Do
Um,
you get hopeful? Are you proud of the industry
I mean,
where it's landing?
yeah, I'm very proud of the industry. I know what I was asking you about Corn. I'll be quick.
Okay, go.
That on that tour, actually, I think it was that tour. I had a lot of we had two video guys that had never been on the road before. They didn't even know what per diem was.
Yeah, crazy.
And,
There's
you
a lot
have
of
to coach them along to get the job done. And you have to try to find the good things that they do, and you know, you can't go around yelling at them, "You're fucking new. I'm going to get rid of you." You know, that had gone out the window.
Yeah.
Um,
A lot more grace given these days for sure.
right, especially after the pandemic. You know, I
Oh
mean,
yeah.
I really noticed it then, and I think, look, as long as training schools, as long as there's a program that teaches them basics, teaches them maybe critical thinking. What are you going to do in a bad situation? What are you going to do? What happens when the truck doesn't show up? I mean, what happens when there's an accident? You know, I mean, these days we got to watch out for, you know, fucking local shooters, and you
Yeah.
know, and mental health, and you
Well,
know, I mean,
right.
there was none of that. So I think the change in the industry is better for a healthy industry. I don't really hold on to the old times, although they were good, but I see a severe lack of, I mean, we're so hard up for people these days,
Yeah.
or we were,
Yeah. We
maybe
still
a
are.
little less now, that, you know, you didn't really have to have much experience to be sent out on a tour.
No.
Because, I mean, you know, the company's not going to say, well, we can't do the tour because we can't crew it. It would take a really
Hmm.
uh, open-minded company to say that, and to have some morals. But, you know, everybody's got to make money. We got to keep the machine rolling. So I always thought there should be a training school,
A
like a
crew coach.
fucking boot camp. And I know that my friends that do the conference at Lidditz
Yeah.
are starting to do a little bit of that, like truck loading and so on. But that's 3 days.
Well, and
And
they're also doing that stuff with the academy, the academy, the Live Entertainment Academy that came from the UK and started their facility, and it's a 2 and 4 year program. Crew Coach is literally the only program out there that talks about this stuff, about the things that actually matter, the glue of communication, of rapport, of consistency, of resilience, of critical thinking, like all these things that actually matter, presentation. We're the only thing right now that exists. And unfortunately, that's why we have a lot of people from these programs in crew coaches, because they don't offer that sort of bridge. And that's the important stuff. That's the important stuff, because the gigs these days are way easier to get. You don't have to be as tenacious, even though we encourage them and I coach them to do so. You don't have to be as tenacious as writing letters and all the things these days, because there's so many more gigs than there are crew these days, except we just need a better crew force, a better, more connected, mission driven crew force out there. And we're not, unfortunately, getting that. I think a lot of these people are going from these programs to maybe an internship to learn a little bit. They're getting thrown out on the road, and the road is still hard, and it can eat people up. As comfortable as it is these days, it eats people up emotionally. I mean, like I was telling you before, we get a lot of people that join crew coach and go, man, I wish I had this on my last tour, because I couldn't control myself. I got too, short tempered, or I got too, emotional, or I let this affect me or that affect me, or I couldn't seem to get along with this person or that person, or when things were out of the norm, it shook me up so much. And that's why, like I said, crew coach has been so valuable to the industry, and it's going to get bigger for us for sure. But you're right, like we need more of this type of stuff attached to those programs of the tech side.
yeah, like I said, it's practical experience. Now I got practical experience from doing it and being yelled at. So,
Well, same
um,
here.
and
And
kids,
actually,
people are sensitive now.
it's a different
People are
world.
not thick skinned. You know,
It is a different world, and one of our big values here in Crew Coach is that resilience in having thick skin. And the reason why is because of necessity. Like you said it best, it's really hard these days because of the how much is at stake to just go out there and wing it. Crew Coach is born out of the necessity of that.
I think, now that I learn more about what you're doing, and maybe that's my second career. I don't know. I
Yeah.
mean, I'm really getting, I'm really slowing down. I still work. I still do tours. I'm healthy. I mean, I don't treat people the same way. I don't treat myself the same way. But it took me longer to learn that than how to be a roadie. I mean, although I had mentors along the way, it was kind of a hard edge mentor. It was like, here, now you're fucking doing it.
That's
So it wasn't, there wasn't coddling. There wasn't time for it because you were on the road. So, and and I like that people are getting help, and the stability. I mean, a lot of people break down on the road, or they start drinking, or they start doing drugs, and then they miss home, and then they don't do a very good job, and that's their demise.
That's right.
And armed with the right tools of not even the the knowledge, or the like a new video guy, or a new audio guy that works for a company, not even that kind of knowledge of how to do it, but how to act.
That's right. That's right. That's exactly what we do here in Crew Coach, man. We have our four pillars, which is career, connection, community, core, and we talk about things like relationships on and off the road, and how to be, in my case, a better husband and a better father from tour, to where you can still tour happy and not, one of our biggest things that we talk a lot about is how this industry is very incredible. I mean, obviously we have a choice and we wouldn't do anything else, but there's a lot of people that have some of the best gigs out there that literally hate life. They wish they
Yeah.
were at home, and it's just like that. We can combat that by really reinstilling a bunch of these values that we teach here in Crew Coach. But all of that to say, because I kind of want to land the plane here. So through all of this, where do you see the industry going over this next maybe even 5 or 10 years, or is it getting so big with technology and everything so fast that you're just unsure?
I mean, I think, I mean, I see also a change musically.
Mm-hmm.
um there's not a lot of, there's Pro Tools, and there's tracks, and there's the spectacle of it, and the some of the self-importance, and that is not, I don't know that that's healthy. I think the technology and what you can do is amazing. I do long for some more basics, but I like some of the changes that have been made. I mean, look, maybe, as I was fighting my way through myself and not treating people right, having a having a reputation as an asshole or a bully or both. um maybe that's not acceptable now. And at that point, if I mean, look, I because of that reputation, I'm sure there's a lot of work I haven't gotten. And people don't always forget. One of my favorite quotes is, people will always remember you from how you treated them. And that's Maya Angelou. So, and I never took stock in that. So I hope that part of it is better. I hope it doesn't lose its soul. And I kind of grimace at the fact that, I think when you are trained in schooling, and you come into the industry when you're, graduated college in your 20s, and you've spent 5 years learning maybe what's going to be your craft, that the camaraderie of that, and learning from other people in a practical experience, I think some of that's going to get lost, and it already has.
Yeah.
I see unfortunately a lot of entitlement, like, where a 25-year-old who's just been hired, if I come off like an asshole to him, he's not gonna. It's not acceptable. He's either gonna quit, or he's gonna make some complaint. And now these days, there's HR involved, or there's a different code of ethics, which I think is okay. But sadly, I think some of it's lost its soul. Um, and but everything changes, and music is still great. It's still a great life. We don't have to remain carnies, and all of that. And I mean, that's what I'll always remember. I don't think I'll really remember that all these kids went to school and everybody was new, and that it became different. I mean, just to cite an incident, I put a tour together for Kendrick Lamar, and we used the audio company. They've been bought by Claire by now, 8th Day,
Yeah.
or
Sound
Sound
image.
Image, sorry.
Yeah.
And I
Yeah.
remember that I was talking to the person there that books the crew, and started asking about the crew, and he starts explaining to me, and the first thing he said is that, well, they've all come out of college. And I'm like, what the fuck does that matter?
Yeah.
And like, Bobby, you have to work this equipment these days, and to understand how sound works in buildings, and measurements, and how stuff is designed. You can't, it's not putting up a PA and, oh, it sounds good, right? Now it's all calculated, and you have to know math, and you have to know more things than you did before. But and my question was, do they know how to load a truck?
Yeah.
Now, I'll say that as much of the time as I maybe have a reputation as a hard ass and a not so nice person, I don't really like the term asshole, because I don't know that that really fits. Certainly doesn't fit anymore.
Yeah.
But I took these three guys, I call them the three amigos. I took these guys under my wing, and I decided that they were good people. I liked their attitude. And I sat them down and I said, look, you're going to learn how to load trucks. You're going to learn how to get yelled at. You're going to learn how to do things quick. And you're going to develop a bit of a hard skin, but I will always have your back. And those three guys have gone on to be crew chiefs,
Yeah.
very successful. And look, if it wasn't me, maybe it would have been someone else. I'm not patting myself on the back. But I think, as people like me have to do, we have to succumb to what the new age is presenting us if we want to continue. You know,
Yeah, for sure.
I'm weighing that out myself right now. So
Well, yeah, I understand that, man. Hey, you never know, with the right opportunity and the right tour comes along. You never know. Maybe you'll be teaching, maybe you'll be production managing and teaching yoga in a back dressing room to the crew, because that's this day and age, man. That is this day and age. I actually have done a bunch of yoga on the road, and next thing you know, someone looks in the dressing room going, "Oh, dude, you're doing yoga. Can I join in?" Next thing you know, I literally have the artists, the dancers, half the band, half the crew. They're all doing it, because that's where we're at these days. And so you never know, Bobby. You never know. Well, I do know this, though, man. I'm so grateful that we got to finally do this. We've been talking about doing
me
this
too.
for some years. And I know that we'll be able to do some more. We have some more things coming up in Crew Coach that I know that you would probably would love to be a part of and contribute, especially with that open heart that you've got these days. Speaking of which, what would you, if you had to give one piece of wisdom to somebody that's watching this now in Crew Coach, and they're either in this industry already for a while, which we have a lot of veterans in here, or they're just getting going? What's one piece of wisdom that, if they could just take this with them, it'll serve them along the rest of their career in touring?
Might be have a couple of parts.
Okay.
First of all, listen, keep your boundaries. You don't have to know everything. And, like we talked about before, don't be an asshole.
Yeah.
People will remember. You'd be better off, it's better off when you leave somewhere that people say, oh my God, they were great to work with. I can't wait to have them back. And then the next time you go back, they go, oh yeah, I remember you. You were great to work with, or I like working with you, rather than, oh no, not them again. So that's, if I had anything to change, and I have changed that.
Yeah.
I operate out of kindness now. I operate out of equanimity. And I found that niche. When I first started to change, it was a balance every day, because I didn't really always know how to act. And maybe I became, in some cases, a little too passive, because it still takes a strong, will to do this. But I would gladly say that anybody that this goes to, that wants to reach out, anything else you're doing that's a learning experience for up and coming, or maybe just maintenance, give me a call.
I love that. I love that so much, man. Thank you so much, Bobby, for joining us here in our career chats. here in Crew Coach. Really means a lot. I'll get your email address. I think that might be the best way for them to reach out
Okay.
to you. I'll put Bobby's email address below here in the video. Guys, if there is anything that you want to make a comment on or ask Bobby about, just post a comment in the video below. And Bobby, man, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Again.
Really appreciate what you're doing for people, Kenny. And I know it's egoless, and I know, we all have egos, and you do things and you feel good, but I know that you're coming at it from a good place, and it shows. So I appreciate you.
Yeah, I appreciate that, man. I really, really do. Nothing more fulfilling than seeing people live up to their potential in this industry. The
Exactly.
industry that we're all so called and convicted to do. Well, that's it for this Career Chat Crusader. Once again, post and comment your takeaways. And until next time, y'all, go get it.
All right.